And welcome back from 93.5 FM, your sounds for the holidays on Laramie's home for the holidays. 93.5 FM, KOCA, Laramie. And Dr. Kevin Kilty in Studio 255 right now. This segment brought to you by Chano's Village, Laramie Range Ford, and Perkins Restaurant and Bakery. Dr. Kilty, welcome back to the Talk Shop.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Wonderful to have you back. What did you bring for us today?
Well, this is an interesting tale that I have told in various ways at various times over the past almost 20 years now. And I'm going to give it a try on radio. We'll see how it goes.
Well, take us away.
Last Christmas, there was an interesting article in the Jerusalem Post. And before I get started, I should mention, we're going to put up a PDF file so that people who are really interested in this can go grab that PDF file. And it's a listener's guide to what goes on today, because some of this is going to be maybe a little confusing.
All right.
But the article in the Jerusalem Post, and there's a link to it in that reader's guide, talked about where is Jesus buried, an interesting topic. And this is something I didn't know until just recently, is that where Jesus is buried is largely a function of what denomination of Christianity a person follows. So Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Coptic Christians think it's the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Protestant denominations think it's a tomb called the Garden Tomb, which is north of Old Jerusalem. And that's a very old tomb. It's been known since before 700, before the current era. So it seems to me that that's kind of unlikely that it was buried there. And then they talked about the Talpiot tomb, which is largely unknown to the public. It's a tomb that's on at the base of Talpiot Hill, about halfway down the Bethlehem Road from Jerusalem. And at the time of this article, they talked about what the situation looked like as of 2015. So their article was well behind the times. And how do I know it's behind the times? Because I've been working on the Talpiot tomb and the physical evidence there for nearly 20 years now. Let's go back and let's just set the stage circa 1980. In 1980, there was a huge construction boom in Jerusalem, and that boom started after the 1967 war, when Jerusalem had been reunified by the IDF. Building all over the place, and in blasting a foundation for a condominium along the Talpiot Road, they encountered a tomb. And as they always have to do, they bring in the Israeli Antiquities Authority to do a quick excavation of the tomb, log its context, do what can be done very quickly so as not to halt construction. That tomb was buried in an awful lot of sediment, and they took from it 10 ossuaries. That's what their notes say that day. They were taken away to the IAA itself for further study, and then they closed up the tomb. Now, it turns out that afterward, since those ossuaries were buried in so much sediment, they couldn't really see what was on the sides of the ossuaries. And probably people don't know what an ossuary is. An ossuary is a bone box. It has been carved out of chalk. They're usually about 2.5 feet by maybe 18 inches by perhaps a foot deep, something like that. And Jewish burial practices at the time, you laid your dead relative out and let the body excarnate for a year. And once the flesh had decayed and there were really nothing but bones left, you came back and you put those bones in the bone box. And then it had its own separate compartment within the tomb. The tombs were often closed then with a closing stone. In 1980, on this particular tomb, the closing stone was gone. The tomb was filled with sediment. No one had really noticed that there were bone boxes in there or not, because as you know, there's quite a traffic in relics in the Middle East, and people steal them and sell them on the antiquities markets. Well, this one had been undisturbed because no one knew that there was anything there. Been buried in 18 inches of sediment. At the same time, there is a bone box that has the name on it, Jacob, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And it comes into the possession of an antiquities dealer in Jerusalem. And he can't read the entire inscription, so presumably he doesn't know a great deal about how valuable a find like that might be. And it sits either in his garden or in his house for the next 20 years. All right, that sets the story. All of this takes place 1980 or thereabouts. In about year 1994, a BBC group finds out that the ossuaries taken from the tomb that I'm talking about contain an amazing sequence of names. Jesus, son of Joseph, Mary, Yosef, which in the Gospel of Mark is one of Jesus' brothers, referred to just that way. There is a Judah, and there is one that is inscribed not in Aramaic like the others are, but in Greek. And it's Mariamne Mara, which in Greek would translate roughly as Lady Mary. This picks up their attention, and they make a short documentary of this, which airs in 1996, but it doesn't really go anywhere. One of the persistent fallacies in this entire thing is that the names on the ossuaries coming from that tomb, despite the fact that they list an awful lot of the Jesus family, they say the names are very common names, and so this combination really is not anything unexpected. And that is a doctrine that really inhibits real research into the tomb. In year 2000, somehow, Herschel Shank, who is a director of some biblical organization in the United States, has found out about the James ossuary in the possession of the antiquities dealer, and has arranged to have it come to North America and be on display at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Oh, that thing caused a huge stir. He had gotten a permit to transport it out of Israel and get it to Canada, but the antiquities authorities knew nothing of the bone box because it had been on the antiquities market. They didn't know anything about the inscription on it, and it caused such a stir that people began calling the Antiquities Authority and asking them about it. And of course, that's an embarrassment if you're the Antiquities Authority and you don't know anything about this fairly spectacular find. That leads to about a 7-year-long ordeal where the antiquities dealer is accused of fabricating the inscription on the bone box, and so forth and so on. The end result of the trial of that antiquities dealer was that no one could prove that that inscription was new. It's definitely an ancient bone box. And I think the general consensus is that at least the James, son of Joseph part of the inscription is definitely ancient. Whether the rest of the inscription was added at a later time, there are two camps that argue about that, and so forth. Now, a documentary producer by the name of Simka Yakubovici, who is the naked archaeologist, if you remember that from the History Channel, is putting together a documentary on that James ossuary, which he hopes is really interesting and leads to an awful lot of viewership. He is surprised to find out that the Antiquities Authority didn't really know anything about this. So at a later time, he goes and visits the Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem and talks about this bone box. Why did a bone box that says James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, if that's the full inscription, why did that not cause a bigger stir and more investigation? And of course, he runs into the dogma of those are common names, there must be lots of ossuaries like this, and so forth. And someone at the Antiquities Authority says, why are you bothering with that one when we've got bone boxes that say Jesus, son of Joseph, in the place? This surprises him. He wants to see these, and he's shown that there really are only two. One which was found in 1931, the other came out of that Talpiot tomb. And he notices that the one that came out of the Talpiot tomb has come from a shelf where there is Mary, Yosef, and so forth and so on, other names from the Jesus family. And he says, good Lord, why did this not cause a bigger stir? And of course, it's the usual. oh, those are common names and they don't mean much. He and a historian at the University of North Carolina by the name of James Tabor embark on a several-year journey of fully exploring that tomb, a nearby tomb in the Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem. And they have a statistician by the name of Andre Fairverger at the University of Toronto do some calculations that say the odds are 599 against 1 that this is the tomb of the Jesus family, because the names are such an odd combination. They air a documentary in March of 2007 that led to quite a stir. And it led to Ted Koppel even interviewing them on, I don't know what ABC's nighttime program was. Maybe it was Nightline.
Nightline, I believe.
Nightline, something like that, in March. And so there was a big stir. Now, at this time, remember, by training, by education, I'm a physicist and a geophysicist, and by avocation, I'm an engineer, and mainly a mechanical engineer. But I'm a pretty capable statistician. I've taught statistics, I don't know how many times at universities, ranging from Washington State University to LCCC in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Park College, and so forth. So the history instructor, I'm teaching at LCCC at the time, and the history instructor there, Mark Elliott, who's also an instructor of religion, got a hold of me and said, what could we do to advance knowledge of this tomb? And I read Fairverger's paper, and it was full of kind of odd statistics, because nobody has ever tried to look at how you prove who's in a tomb using names before. And he has come up with a new measure, which he calls surprisingness, and that's what led to his 599 to 1 estimate. And it contains a lot of ad hoc stuff, like he divides by a factor of 4 in one place to account for what he thinks might be going on in one place or another. And these are very ad hoc calculations. And other statisticians looked at this and they said, well, maybe this measure of surprisingness will turn out to be a rigorous measure of something, and maybe it won't. But they're withholding judgment at the time. Well, after looking at it, I said to myself, this is almost a perfect example of where we could do Bayesian statistics and make some headway. Now, to back up a little bit, let's talk about statistics. I don't know, not very many people have taken a statistics course in college or in high school. So I'll just talk briefly about statistics. There are 3 schools of statistics. One is the common school. This is taught in all statistics courses. It's called the frequentist approach. And we do our sampling, and we think that sample comes from a particular type of probability distribution, and we make an acceptance and rejection area based on that probability distribution. And then we look at a statistic drawn from our sample, the sample that we have taken, real data using. And we decide if the statistic falls in the rejection or acceptance region and so forth. And other people will recognize that if you look at medicine, they talk about p-values on efficacy of drugs and so forth. P-values are part of this standard approach to statistics. Confidence intervals, people have probably looked at those. Those are part of that same method of doing statistics. There's another method. Thomas Bayes was a reverend in England, and he came up with a theorem that showed that there are multiple ways to arrive at a probability based on evidence. And some of those ways of arriving at that are very simple to calculate, and some are quite complicated. And so an example of a complicated thing to try to calculate is, what is the probability of this being the Jesus tomb given the collection of names that we observe on the ossuaries? That's a complicated one. But it can be formulated in terms of a different problem, which is, what is the probability of finding these names, assuming that that is the Jesus tomb? And I should have brought a Venn diagram to show people on radio. Venn diagrams were in the news, a year and a half ago or so. You can prove this with a Venn diagram. you can prove Bayes' theorem. But at any rate, we've got everything we need in this problem to apply Bayes' theorem and find the complicated probability. What do we have? Well, it turns out scholars have looked at the first century Jerusalem and have determined name distributions. We know in our own time that the name John, for example, is far more common than the name Kevin, as an example. And we could actually go through the population and find out how much more common is that. We could find out of 1 million people how many are named John versus how many are named Kevin and whatnot. Scholars have done this for the area that the Romans called Palestine, ultimately, in the first century. That's the relevant time period and whatnot. And it turns out the most common male name is Shimon, and the second most common is Joseph. But it really isn't all that common. It's only 9% of men's names are Joseph. And you get down to names like Yossi, there is less than 3 1,000ths of those in the population. That's a very rare name. I've got that information. I know from Scripture, which is our best source in this case, of what a number of names in the Jesus family were. Names like Yossi, Joseph, Mary, and so forth. I can use those names now to make a little table that says, here are the total number of name combinations that we might find in a Jesus tomb, and we'll just assume that any one of those combinations is equally probable. And this one is just one of those. And it turns out that the probability of observing this one, if it's actually the Jesus family tomb, is about 3%. Not a big probability. But what would be the probability of taking the name distribution in Jerusalem, which we know of from scholarly work? What would be the probability of just having these names show up in the tomb then, drawing from the general population? That's a very tiny number. It's only 38 in 1 million. So using those probabilities and Bayes' theorem, we reasoned as follows. Jews didn't haul dead people around on roads to get them back to their place of origin for burial. You buried them quickly. That was the custom. If Jesus and his family were in Jerusalem and buried there, there's a tomb that has that family in it someplace, most likely. And we have found about 1,000 tombs in Jerusalem at this point. It's unlikely that they'll find more because Jerusalem is very heavily built up now. And if there were more, they would have been encountered, or they are so well buried below buildings now that we'll likely never find them, but it's always a possibility. So we say the probability of just a random draw from any one of those tombs being that containing the remains of that family is about 1 in 1,000. If we use Bayes' theorem and the probabilities that we calculated otherwise, suddenly that tomb, the Talpiot tomb, looks like it has even odds of being the tomb of that family. The probability tells you there's only very likely to be one other tomb with such a distribution of names in it. That should have alerted people that's a pretty important tomb and should have done more work on it. But in fact, at the time, this is, circa 2007, 2008, I didn't know that there was other physical evidence available. And Mark and I published a couple of papers on this, and then we let the issue die. It turns out there was someone in Jerusalem who knew quite a lot more about this and knew that there was physical evidence in places of how important that tomb is. And he's a geochemist by the name of Ari Shimron, and he has a collaborator by the name of Moshe Sharav. And they said, if that tomb was buried in sediment, the ossuaries inside of it have to be chemically distinct from all other ossuaries in Jerusalem. Now, if you think about this for a second, you go, we don't know the origin of the James ossuary. I'm going to talk about it once again because it's a separate thread of this story at this point. We don't know the origin of it. It was just on the antiquities market. Nobody knows where it came from. But if the Talpiot tomb has a lot of the Jesus family names in it, you'd say to yourself, the reasonable expectation is that it also was in that tomb at one time. Ari began working on proving chemically, or at least analyzing chemically, whether it's very likely that that ossuary came out of that tomb.
Each of the bones?
These are not the bones. I should back up and say, if you know anything about Israel, the Orthodox Jews will demand that those bones be reburied almost pronto when they find a tomb. And so there isn't much of bones left of evidence. There are some bone fragments in some of these things. And as you know, with modern chemical methods, we can do a lot with bone fragments. And I can talk just briefly about one interesting find later. But right now, all I'm talking about are names. It would be no different if we had entered the Talpiot tomb and I just saw a plaque on the wall that said, this is the tomb of Joseph and Jesus and Yossi and Mary and so forth. If I'd only seen that plaque, I'd go, this is a pretty unusual tomb. It's unusual to find that distribution of names unless it's the Jesus family, and then it's quite likely, right? So I'm just talking about names and nothing more. And a lot of people have trouble with that because, as you know, there are a lot of people who are saying there should be no remains of Jesus left on the planet. Well, I'm not talking about remains at all. I'm just talking about names. All right. I've gotten lost a little bit here. There's now a gap in the whole story because I think I've done what I can. I've done what I can on what I know. In 2015, I got an email from Ari Shimron and Moshe Sharav. And Ari Shimron was looking at a chapter in a book that I had written. And he said, I'm reading the chapter of this book, and he says, I think you're a guy that can help us explain what we're seeing in the statistics, and you can tell a story pretty clearly. So I got involved in the project, and that led to the next 5 years of being involved with these guys. And I have to tell you, these characters are a lot of fun. They're really interesting people. And what they were doing was they had sampled the incrustation on the inside of the bone boxes, the James ossuary, and the ossuaries in the Talpiot tomb. And then they had sampled a few others from the Jerusalem area that were in the possession of the Antiquities Authority. And they were trying to use those as a control group. Well, at the time, they didn't have a large enough control group. They needed a lot more sampling. They needed a lot more chemical analyses. And these analyses are run in a variety of ways, but this is advanced chemical instrumentation. It's the sort of stuff that crime scene investigation would use and try to determine things. And in Israel, as you know, archaeology and the Bible are hot potato issues. And it finally gets to the point where people don't want to cooperate with Ari very much because they're all worried about being dragged into controversy. So he needs an awful lot of chemical analyses done. And this brings in some other people. A fellow by the name of Ludwig Halitz, who's from the University of Warsaw, and two Norwegians, Rolf Peterson and Harald Furnes, who are at the University of Bergen in Norway. And they begin providing additional chemical support. Now you can imagine we're now looking at chemical analyses done by who knows how many labs. I never even really looked into that. So that's a confusing issue because you do two analyses in two different labs, even if it's of the same sample, and you might get slightly different results. That adds some confusion to the whole thing. And it takes a very long time to do this, but by 2019 or so, the story is pretty clear, at least to me. Now, Ari and Moshe, being geochemists, had been trying to make their case on what we call the trace elements in samples. So they were looking at things like cobalt and manganese and things like that. The story isn't at all clear down at that level, and they had been making diagrams of various kinds that I think were really unconvincing. And when I got involved in this, I decided that the major element chemistry, aluminum, potassium, sodium, calcium, magnesium, things like that, because they're much larger concentrations in each sample, it's much easier to tell a story with those. And it was quite obvious that the James ossuary had a different chemistry than the other ossuaries in Jerusalem, except those that came out of the Talpiot tomb. And I was just going to, now this will be on video, so let's look at my flip chart here, and I'll just show you two things that I came up with to make my case for that. And let me know when you're ready. You got a thumb up. That means ready.
We're ready.
In our world, thumbs up. That's ready.
Support vector.
A support vector machine. You've probably heard of machine learning, which is, part of AI, if you think about it. Computer programs are machines, they're virtual machines, and they're able to learn and whatnot. So I put together a support vector machine. I just want to, my machine is going to I'm going to give my machine chemical analysis from a sample, and it's going to tell me whether it belongs to the Talpiot tomb or the non-Talpiot, somewhere else in Jerusalem. And I can build any number of these support vector machines, but this one turned out to be pretty nice. It involves potassium on one side, measured in percent. Percent is pretty large concentration. And manganese, which is one of those trace elements measured in parts per million. And here's a line on this chart, and for people who remember their high school algebra, most people try to forget that damn high school algebra once they're out of high school. I've used Excel, surprisingly enough, to make the best possible separation of these chemistries in this two-dimensional space of potassium against manganese. And I plug in the numbers for the concentrations into this line. And it doesn't end up on the line, obviously. They end up on one side of it, typically. And if it's to the right of that line, it came from the Talpiot tomb. And if it's to the left of that line, it's non-Talpiot. Now, I built this machine out of a small subset of the data, and I saved the rest of the data to test the machine. So once I've got the machine built, I test it. And it turns out that the machine never takes a non-Talpiot sample and puts it in the Talpiot group. It's 100% effective at making that separation. Once in a while, something that did come from the Talpiot gets over here. It's kind of an outlier and so forth, but that's very rare too. This machine is probably 85% effective in separating these things. And if I've got two samples taken from the James ossuary, one done in Israel, I think itself, and another done in Norway. They have slightly different values. I take those two, they both plot up here, Talpiot. Obvious as can possibly be. If there weren't a good case for the James ossuary coming from the Talpiot tomb, it would be tough for me to do that. It's really obvious, the difference between those two samples. And why is this? Well, this is what Ari Shimron knew that no one else really seemed to recognize. In the book, The Jesus Discovery, written by James Taylor and Simcha Jacobovici, they said, that tomb that we opened up, or that the Israeli Authority opened up, was filled with sediment, and that sediment had accumulated over centuries slowly. That isn't what happened at all. Ari Shimron knew that there was an earthquake in Jerusalem in 363 of the current era, and it caused landslides on the Talpiot Hill. You can see the results of those landslides even today, because there are piles of colluvium at the base of the hill and so forth. That landslide rolled the closing stone on the Talpiot tomb away, filled the tomb almost instantly with debris from the hillside, sealed it away from all other tombs in Jerusalem, and made it unique. It now had a unique chemistry. Amazing. What a fabulous accident. At any rate, this was one argument. We ended up not using this argument. I think it's a little difficult to make a case that people will understand. Oh, this paper is tough. So I made another argument. This one's more along the lines of real statistics. This is a studentized plot. What does studentized mean? If anyone's taken statistics, they've heard of student's t distribution. It is a sampling distribution, and it is probably the most widely used statistical test in the world. What I have done is I've taken samples, and I have subtracted the mean value of the big sample and divided by the standard deviation. And this makes all probability distributions cluster around the origin down here. So I have a cluster down here, which is the totality of our control group from Jerusalem. Many, many dozens of ossuaries were sampled, and they all plot down here around the origin. And if I take the ossuaries from the Talpiot tomb and put them on the same plot, they plot down here in the origin too. I've studentized the values so that all of them are normalized, so they'll plot near the origin. What do I do about the James ossuary? There are two ways I could studentize those two values. One way to studentize would be to use the mean and the standard deviation from the totality of all tombs or all ossuaries in Jerusalem. The other would be to just use the Talpiot tomb, use the standard deviation and the mean for it. If I use the Talpiot tomb, the James ossuaries plot right down here at the origin. They behave like they came from that distribution. If I try to use the values from the control group, those two plot way the devil up here. They plot 5 standard deviations away from the origin. In the world of probability, 5 standard deviations is hugely improbable. That was the best argument I could make in a single diagram to say the James ossuary did not come from elsewhere in Jerusalem. It spent at least a long portion of its history in that Talpiot tomb. How did it get out of the Talpiot tomb? Well, the IAA took out 10 ossuaries, and they can only account for 9. So there's at least some possibility that it was stolen after they'd excavated the tomb. There's a possibility it was stolen at some other time. It's always possible. There are grave robbers in the Middle East, all over the place. There's also a possibility, I suppose, that it was actually in some other tomb that was affected by that landslide. In other words, it was in some other tomb that got that landslide material in it and covered that ossuary for a while so that it got the same chemistry as the ones in the Talpiot tomb. That's how they got their chemistry, from the landslide materials. Will we ever find that tomb? I doubt it. It's already, if it were existent, we would have found it already, because Jerusalem is really built up. And if we haven't found it by now, we're not going to find it, probably. But all I can say to that possibility is time will tell. I'll be long gone by then, but maybe we'll finally agree on this. I think this is a convincing diagram. This is what went into our final paper. I've got our final paper is listed in the Reader's Guide, so people can go look at it. It's open access.
Wonderful.
And what else could I say about this? I guess I could talk about one other kind of interesting thing that I don't really want to tie into this story. But I think this sort of physical evidence answers the question about where was Jesus buried, even if he was only buried momentarily. I doubt there's another tomb like this in the Jerusalem area. This is an unusual tomb. And if the Jesus family is in the Jerusalem area, this is the tomb. So we'll leave that there.
Dr. Kevin Kilty, and where Jesus is buried. Today on the Talk Shop, we appreciate you listening, and we'll be back in a moment with another segment.
At any rate, I will talk about this other thing, even though there's nothing in the Reader's Guide.